We have already a large fleet and many on order. The other main change, I guess, is the use of lighter weight carbon composite hull structures. These are already delivering 10% plus fuel burn improvement, and these are first generation improvements, so there'll be more to come, I think. So this all adds up, and if we look at the change from the fuel burn per seat of the 707 in 1960 to the Airbus A380 today, it's a real improvement. It's about 80%. So actually significantly more than the fuel improvements we've seen in marine. If we're looking further out, it may not just be design, science fiction, fantasy to imagine a blended wing body as eventually one giant wing in which the passengers would be seated. I've seen designs on both Boeing and Airbus planning drawing boards, but I think we have to assume that execution is probably 20 years away. But it's not impossible. Perhaps in shorter order, the next big thing may be the use of biofuels. It's not a particularly well-known fact. I think that modern aircraft can accept 100% biofuel, but both from the perspective of energy content and also of freezing temperatures. But the huge hurdle is to manufacture the stuff and deliver it at a competitive price point and with a guarantee of sufficient volume. And in the marine sector, of course, LNG, wind fuel cells, nuclear are all the subject of concerted research, but none, I think, have yet been found at the end of our ocean rainbow. Perhaps I've not mentioned the most dramatic change, which is that wrought by the astonishing improvements in information transfer and the consequent certainties with which passengers or cargo can be tracked on an hourly basis. The logistics industry's greatest gift to mankind since the invention of the wheel and of the marine container has most probably been the electronically transmitted manifest. In 2006, The Economist published an article on what it called the Golden Age of Growth, and ascribed the birth of our golden age, first and foremost, to improvements in inventory management. The paper described this award as a dull but irreversible conclusion. That sounds very good, but the runner-up, I'm afraid, was improvements in bank credit monitoring. So given this was 2006, you might say it was an easy victory. In the course of the last, I'm afraid, rather long half hour, I've wandered backwards and forwards between transport modes. But in doing this, the fact that I have not had time to even touch on issues as fascinating as our industry's environmental challenge and obligations, the cost and burden of government over-regulation, the astonishing phenomenon of China's railway construction, and the ever-present security issues that we all face, does suggest to me that a working life in shipping or aviation should remain attractive for our children. Mine don't think so, but I think so. There are no other careers that I can think of that offer the same hands-on experience of different industries. The chance to meet and interact with people from a wide variety of cultures and backgrounds, the endless opportunities to travel, and the good fellowship and entrepreneurial spirit that I've always felt are particularly charming and wonderful characteristics of the marine industry, so splendidly represented by this distinguished audience. These attributes make it a career choice that I would happily make again, I promise you, if I were a more passionate believer in reincarnation than I probably am, despite your comments about my yoga. I draw the line at that. And who knows, I might always be reincarnated in a bull Bifex market. As I close, I must thank our host, the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore. I remember clearly that it was with a heavy heart that Swire moved our two shipping businesses from Hong Kong to Singapore over the last 20 years. It was really sad for us to leave a home at Hong Kong where we had been so long and where we felt such a part of a still important and vital marine community. But we felt we simply had to be closer to an oil services centre, to ASEAN's premier hub, to a shipbuilding cluster, and to the other splendid range of marine services that Singapore has to offer its owners. We've never looked back and thought and revisited the decision. We're so happy with it. And since then, I can only say that we have been given the most wonderfully warm welcome from the word go by the Singapore government and by the local maritime communities, and by the MPA in particular. And we now pride ourselves on being an integral part of the important and marvellously served Marine Centre that hosts the speech and conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes-Hellert. May I now invite Dato' Jude Benny to join Mr. Hughes-Hellert on stage for the dialogue session. Dato', please.
All right, we're in business. Firstly, James, thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. It's not often that we can lock this number of shipping people in a room and make them face the reality of comparison with another industry in the way that you have, and it's really been fascinating, because I don't think, we often go to conferences and lectures and talks, and it's very much always on the shipping or in the shipping context. But I think you've made comparisons which I think will make people sit back and think a lot about what shipping can do in terms of learning from the aviation industry. So we've got about 25 minutes to try and take some questions. So in the usual Singapore tradition, the moderator generally has to ask the first question, because it takes a while for the engines to crank up. So while you crank up, perhaps I will ask you the first question, if I may. And again, it draws on the comparison between the maritime and the aviation world. And one of the vexing questions that we've had to face here in Singapore is the image of the maritime industry. Because it affects the ability to draw talent into the industry. So the image and improving the image of the maritime industry has been always at the forefront of what the SMF, the Singapore Maritime Foundation, and the MPA try to do. Now, I'm just wondering if there are lessons that the maritime world can draw from the aviation industry and the airline world in terms of trying to improve the image of the maritime industry, or is this a case where just no amount of mascara is going to do the job? It's and it's we've got a bad rap. I mean, we know for a fact that in terms of what the maritime industry does, it's probably one of the cleanest, it's one of the most efficient. Notwithstanding that, it's always had an image problem. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess. Am I turned on? Yeah, good. I mean, truthfully, I live in England now and have done for the last 6 or 7 years, and the marine industry attracts almost no attention at all in England. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's partly because we have very few ship owners, I guess. But I think that the areas we need to concentrate on probably as an industry are twofold. I think all transport industry has to look as far ahead as we can and think about fuel consumption, explain what we're doing, because I think we're doing a lot more than the consumer would give us credit for. And I think if owners of ships...
sorry, James, I think...
I've got another one.
Yes. Okay, that's better.
If owners of ships were to get together and not talk about price, obviously, but were to make stronger statements about the determination to voluntarily find ways to make sure that regulation was applied globally, that the industry as a whole was passionate about the environment, I think it might make a difference. I mean, we're going to be mandated otherwise. We're going to be made to do stuff that's going to be extremely expensive and arguably unaffordable. I mean, the returns are so low in shipping that I think we have to tell our story before we have an imposition of a cost burden in terms of altering our assets that's just going to be unacceptable. So I don't sense that the industry has a strong enough voice in that regard, just in telling our story. And the other thing I think is perhaps manning. I think the manning industry, I think, again, probably people who are outside the industry think that the manning industry, that seafarers are subject to brutal and unprincipled owners. And of course they are still, to some extent, if you look at some flag states, regulations still unsatisfactory. But generally I would say that the lot of the seafarer nowadays is greatly improved from where it was. And I think that's another story we could tell.
All right. The floor is open to anyone with a question. Please identify yourself and the organization that you're from. And we've got roving mics, so they'll find you and they'll bring a microphone to you. So any questions from the floor? Yes, Andreas?
Andreas Somenpau from BW Group. You referred to the role of the state in the airline industry, and we're starting to see this encroaching in the shipping industry as well through various different forms. One is state-owned companies, another is local content requirements, another is, in some countries, the preference for local cargoes being carried on local ships. Do you think that this trend of state capitalism is likely to continue? And if so, how should independent airlines and shipping companies position themselves? What should we do about it?
Well, I hope it's unlikely to continue, of course. It's something that slightly waxes and wanes. I alluded to the fact that the era sort of strong national preference as far as shipping was concerned had seemed to me to have waned quite substantially compared with the sort of 60s and 70s. And frankly, Andreas, I'm not that close to the detail of shipping these days to realise that it may have come back in some sort of form. Because marine fleets move around from country to country, it's hard to tell where national preference may apply next. There wouldn't be much point in almost any European country applying national preference now if there aren't any shipping companies of any size, and I except Scandinavia, I should hasten to say. I don't know the answer, I don't think. As far as airlines are concerned, I think that the gradual move towards open skies is inexorable, and you can see that in the rise of the LCC. I think proves that the traffic rights regimes still exist, and they exist, I think, principally to ensure that there's a level playing field. But certainly, the rigidity of traffic rights has considerably loosened over the last 30 years.
All right. Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Bengt Hermelin from Samco. You're a large operator of both ships and aeroplanes. What can we and the record of shipping goes back a bit to the initial question here. Record of shipping on the safety side can certainly be improved, whereas on the airline side, I think last year was one of the best records on ever in the history of aviation. What can we learn on the safety side from your practices of operating an airline, which we could transfer to the shipping side and improve our quality of operations?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the main thing, it seems to me, the main thing is to ensure that application of regulation is as far as possible consistent throughout the world. we can see that strict application of safety regulation in developed economies means that the safety statistics at sea are very good, and particularly in port. But as soon as you get away from the more traditional ship-owning nations, then it becomes more irregular. And around the coasts of Africa, for example, parts of Asia, the application is probably good in terms of letter, but poor in terms of practice. And I think all one can do is to continue to highlight geographies where that's not the case, and just bring publicity to bear. And it is possible to make marine cargo carriage extremely safe. Everyone in the room knows this. It's a question of sticking to very sensible rules that have been developed over many decades, but practice is still quite shoddy in certain regimes, and I think it's just a question of naming and shaming, and I'm afraid it'll still take a long time until we have completely consistent application. But in aviation, I would say we are very close to achieving that.
Just to follow up on that, from the training and manning perspective, I've got a brother who flies, as a captain, and half the time he seems to be going to the simulator or trying to prepare for another test or exam or something, and it seems to me that they're constantly being kept on their toes, which I don't think you see something similar in terms of shipping, and I'm wondering if that has any impact on safety, or if it can have any impact on safety.
Well, we think that's important, actually, and Jude, I'd love to get J.B. Ray Smith, who's somewhere in front of me, to take you to our marine training centre just about 2 miles down the road, actually. We can show you a very fantastic simulator. And I think all ship owners should be willing to invest in simulators and training centres and all that sort of stuff, and which can, and certainly our own training centre is something we have sort of borrowed to some extent from the training centres we operate for the airline. It's very comparable. You can have an extremely advanced and effective simulator, for example, for a bridge, for navigation, for dealing with difficult sea conditions. And I think which just makes, safety should be just as high a priority at sea. And I think we can apply the same sort of rules and training methods. But we're shamefully, I think, still early days. But
something to think about.
Yeah, but we have a good one here.
All right. Any other question from the floor? Yes, we have one over there.
Thank you for a very good speech. My name is Geir Sjurset with the DVB Bank here in Singapore. You left out the offshore part of your business in your speech. You talked about conventional shipping and aviation. If I recall correctly, you told the press a year ago that the offshore business was a perfect hedge to the aviation business. If you look at the oil price, high oil price should be a good drivers for the offshore business, but fuel cost is certainly 5 billion, you mentioned it, can change your revenues from profits to loss for the aviation industry. If I recall correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if that is true, could we then see a much faster growth in your offshore business going forward compared to the existing involvement in your aviation business? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess the main reason I didn't mention the offshore sector is I didn't want to draw your attention to it because we're trying to keep it a secret. It's about the only bit of it's really quite profitable. We love the offshore business, and I'm so flattered you should remember my saying that. But it is true; it is a sort of perfect hedge to the aviation business. Unfortunately, at the moment at least, our offshore business is a lot smaller than our aviation business. So in terms of quantity, it doesn't really make up. But certainly, a strong oil price does tend to support offshore oil exploration, obviously. And we are growing the business, by our standards, pretty aggressively, actually. We have about 30 boats on order, Joby, about 30 boats on order, and We've delivered 70 this century, and as I said in my opening comments, these are no longer boats, really. I mean, the two boats we have for wind farm installation in the North Sea, are probably $250 million US a piece. So they're quite expensive boats. So we're growing the business very actively, and I discourage anybody else from trying to come to do it. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yes, any more questions from the floor for our speaker? Normally the speaker will speak on maritime issues, but we've covered two major industries here, so there must be interesting questions out there. Well, while the engines warm up again, maybe I can ask you another one. Sorry, you're going to say something?
No, I was going to say let's have a drink, but no. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that.
Well, I was going to ask you about. I mean, you did say in your lecture that this was really the time for Asia in terms of shipping.
Yes.
And my question really is, where do you see Asia shipping or Asian shipping in the next 10 years? I mean, it currently accounts for about 40% of the world's tonnage. Has 8 of the 10 top ports in the world. Builds about 90% of the world's ships. Can it get stronger, or do you think we've hit a plateau, or what is your take on the outlook going forward into the next 10 years?
Well, I think it should be very strong. I mean, I certainly believe in the ongoing Chinese miracle. I mean, the balance between export-led growth and domestic consumption growth will change, but I think exports from China will still be enormous. And I think maybe the composition of the Asian fleets will change. I lived in Japan in the 70s and again in the 1980s, and it's extraordinary nowadays to see how little one reads about Japan. When I was there in the 80s, a day didn't go by when there wasn't another book about the next century being the century of Japanese domination. And it's still the third largest economy in the world, and yet people very rarely think about Japan nowadays. I find it so peculiar, and yet everybody talks about China the whole time, and the demographic difference between India and China is so interesting. It'll be interesting to see how India speeds up over the next decade or two. So, if you take Asia in its broadest sense, I would be a passionate believer that it will still be the cockpit of marine. But I think the components, the mix may change. I think I'm brave enough to identify the next seafaring nation. But yeah, I'm sure it's Asia.
And do you see the opening up by Myanmar as having any kind of effect on the maritime sector? Presently, I mean, certainly they're a player in manning, but do you see the opening up of Myanmar in terms of an economy driving more shipping growth in Asia?
I think it's wonderful news. I mean, I sort of touch wood that it continues to be wonderful news. Wonderful news politically and for the sake of the inhabitants of Myanmar. Of course, Burmese seafarers have been a great element of seafaring since the 19th century. But I think probably, the opening of the Myanmar economy is probably only interesting at the margin. I don't think it'll make a lot of difference. If you think of it in the context of the size of the other, what used to be called the Indo-Chinese countries, they don't make an enormous amount of difference. But Myanmar is very rich in terms of natural commodities, so not insignificant. But I don't think, in this case, a sea change, probably.